Welcome back. We've seen the specimen's journey. Now let's meet the team that moves it along. Because knowing who does what, and crucially, who is allowed to do what, is one of the most important professional judgments you'll build in this course. There are 4 core roles in an anatomical pathology lab: the pathologist, the pathologist's assistant, the histotechnician or histotechnologist, and the cytotechnologist. We'll take them one at a time, see how they fit together in a chain of responsibility, and then arrive at the question that runs through this whole course: which specimens a histotechnician may gross and which must be reserved for someone else? That question isn't about skill, it's about judgment, regulation, and risk, and it's the thread we'll follow all term. Let's meet the team. So, 4 roles do the core work of an anatomical pathology lab. There are others, of course, such as the accessioners, lab assistants, and administrative staff, but these 4 are the people who handle and interpret the tissue itself. On the left, the pathologist, a physician, an MD or DO. Next, the pathologist's assistant, or PA, a master's trained professional. Then the histotechnician and histotechnologist, HT and HTL, which is you and where this program points. And finally, the cytotechnologist, who works with cells rather than intact tissue. Notice, I've put you in the middle of the team because that's where you are, connected to everyone. Let's take each role one at a time, starting with the pathologist, because it's the pathologist's authority that everything else is ultimately measured against. As I said, the pathologist is a physician, an MD or DO, with years of specialized residency training in pathology. Their central job is to render the diagnosis and sign out the case. And with that comes the legal and medical responsibility for the interpretation. When a report goes out with a diagnosis on it, the pathologist stands behind it. They also direct the laboratory and are ultimately accountable for its quality. Here's the concept to hold on to, because it matters for scope of practice. When we talk later about work being delegated, a histotechnician performing gross examination, for instance, it's the pathologist's authority that is being delegated. The pathologist can extend certain tasks to qualified staff under defined conditions, but the responsibility ultimately traces back to them. Keep that in mind. It's the foundation of everything we'll say about scope. The pathologist assistant, or PA, is a master's trained professional who specializes in gross examination. And that includes the complex, high-stakes specimens like cancer resections. PAs are highly skilled prosectors. Grossing is their core expertise. They work under the pathologist's direction, and they don't render the final diagnosis, but they do handle the grossing that requires the most anatomical knowledge and judgment. I want you to keep the PA firmly in mind, because throughout this course, the PA is our reference point for where a histotechnician's grossing scope ends. When we ask, can a histotech gross this specimen, or does it need to go to someone else, that someone else is very often the PA. So, the PA isn't a competitor. They're the professional who handles the specimens that fall outside your delegated scope. And understanding that boundary is central to working safely. Now, the histotechnician and histotechnologist. That's you and where this program points. Your core work is preparing the tissue, so you're doing the processing, embedding, sectioning, and staining that we walked through in the last lecture and that you probably do every day at your job. That's the foundation of the profession. But increasingly, HTs and HTLs also perform gross examination of specific specimens. And notice the conditions attached to that. With the right training, with documented competency, and under supervision. Those conditions aren't optional fine print. They're what makes the delegation legitimate. The difference between HT and HTL is largely a matter of education. Associate level versus bachelor level, with the HTL typically taking on more advanced responsibilities. That grossing role, and precisely where its limits fall, is the thread we'll follow all term. By the end of this course, you'll be able to look at a specimen and know whether it's within your scope or not. The fourth role is the cytotechnologist. Cytotechnologists work with individual cells rather than intact tissue, so screening PAP tests and fine needle aspirates, examining cellular material for abnormalities, and flagging suspicious cases for the pathologist to review. It's a distinct career track with its own credential and training pathway. I'm including it here so that you can see the whole team and understand how the pieces fit, even though this course centers on tissue rather than cytology. If you think back to the subspecialties from Lecture 1.1, the cytotechnologist is the person doing the frontline screening work in cytopathology. So now that we've met all four roles individually, let's put them back together and see how they connect. Because a specimen doesn't belong to just one of them. It usually passes through several hands, and that creates a chain of responsibility. Okay, let's put the team back together. A single specimen passes through several of these people on its way to a diagnosis. It's accessioned, it's grossed, it goes through histology, and it's finally diagnosed. And different roles own different parts of that path. Here's the principle that ties it together. Each person is accountable not only for their own step, but for the quality of what they hand to the next person. The accessioner has to pass a correctly identified specimen to the grossing bench. The person grossing has to pass well-chosen, well-documented sections to histology. Histology has to pass quality slides to the pathologist. And that means the diagnosis is only as reliable as the weakest link in the chain. This is why your work matters even when a task feels routine. A weak link anywhere can compromise the whole case. You are one of those links, and a strong one is what patients depend on. So here's the question that runs through this entire course, and it's worth stating as plainly as I can. What specimens can a histotechnician gross, and which have to be reserved for a PA or a pathologist? Now, here's the key insight, and I want you to resist the obvious wrong answer. The line is not drawn by manual skill. It's entirely possible to be technically capable of cutting into a complex specimen and still not be permitted to gross it. The line is drawn by whether the task requires diagnostic judgment and by regulation and risk. A specimen that just needs to be measured and entirely submitted is very different from one where someone must decide which pieces represent the tumor and establish the margins. That second one requires diagnostic judgment. And all of this is governed by real rules. So CLIA, CAP accreditation standards, professional body positions like the AAPA, and state law. We build that framework carefully starting in week 3. So let's pull it all together. 3 things to carry forward from this lecture. First, 4 roles do the core work: the pathologist assistant, the histotechnician and technologist, and the cytotechnologist. And you now know what each one does. Second, they're connected in one chain of responsibility, where every link matters and the diagnosis is only as strong as the weakest one. And you are one of those links. And third, your scope of practice at the grossing bench is defined not by skill, but by judgment and regulation. And that scope of practice question is the central thread of this whole course. That's the concepts done for week 1. Now it's time to put your hands on something. This week in lab, we begin with the fundamentals: anatomic position, specimen orientation, and measuring in 3 dimensions. Come prepared, pass your pre-lab readiness quiz first, and I'll see you Wednesday. If you're watching this after Wednesday, I hope we had a good time, and I'll see you next week.